Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we are in our 8th and final episode of our combined unit on periods 1 and 2. Today in episode 8, we're going to discuss politics, religion, and empire. So return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. From out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 23, identify the concepts and institutions of colonial politics in the 18th century. You should be able to identify how the Great Awakening challenged religious and social structures in British North America. And number 25, you should be able to explain how the Spanish and French empires in America developed in the 1700s and what was their impact on Indian and white relations. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 23. When we talk about the public sphere, let's begin our discussion with voting in British America. And the right to vote often came with the qualifier of owning property. And the different colonies would have different, rules and different regulations along the way, but most of them more or less required some amount of property ownership. Suffrage was actually more common in the colonies than it was in Britain. So the ability to vote was actually more invested in the colonists than it was to people in the home country. And colonial politics, though, even though it had a greater voting access, was hardly democratic in the sense that we might think of it today. Suffrage was almost universally entitled just to males, and in some colonies, people like Jews and Catholics and Baptists and Quakers had no right to vote. During the 1700s, most black people, even those with property, would lose their rights to vote in the South, and in the North, local customs usually prohibited black voting as well. Native Americans generally altogether excluded from the democratic process. Subpoint B, the real power was held not by the people who were voting, but the people that held their appointed positions. The property qualifications for office holding were usually far higher than voting. So people that, even if they don't have property, they might be able to vote, but they can't go hold office unless they actually own a piece of the colony, have a stake interest in it. But there was also this practice of deference. Deference is it's this idea among ordinary people that just wealth and social prominence just entitled certain people to public office, that just being rich and notable was the kind of the thing that made you a good servant. And so the result was that there oftentimes weren't a lot of choices to voters to pick from. Elected assemblies, they did become more assertive in colonial politics during the 18th century. The most powerful public assembly was in Pennsylvania, and then Massachusetts and New York and Virginia, and then eventually South Carolina and the rest of the colonies. Subpoint C, people in the colonies had widespread literacy. They had a lot of different choices of newspapers. Those newspapers encouraged political discussion, and it was not unusual for even just common people on the street to have pretty well-founded political opinions. In Philadelphia, for instance, Philadelphia, the most important city in the North, Benjamin Franklin founded the first library in colonial America. He owned one of the best colonial newspapers. Benjamin Franklin was a man of intelligence and wit, and he was urbane and well-connected, and then tried to use those connections to go stimulate the public discourse from there. The American gentry were very active in the discussion of politics. There were political clubs in Boston and New York and Philadelphia that would hold debates on literary questions and philosophical questions and scientific issues and political issues, and all of that was seen as part of the social discourse. Discussion wasn't just limited, though, to elites and upper clubs, taverns and coffee houses. They were debate venues, too. Now, freedom of expression also comes with its limits, and freedom of speech was a relatively new idea. Freedom of the press was generally viewed as dangerous. In 1695, a law had lapsed that required a government license to go print books and newspapers and pamphlets. And when the law expired, the government really had no way to censor material and no practical way to do it, even if the law did exist. Still, though, colonial governors were worried about free press and spreading of disinformation, but they had no way to rein it in. There were some protections against libel or sedition. So telling outright lies or things that could be socially dangerous or politically dangerous, those things did have their bans on them. But colonial newspapers defended the idea of freedom of press. They basically said that it's the freedom of the press who protects all of the other liberties. So it becomes like that freedom of speech becomes the central piece of the rest of liberty. But it was really the elected assemblies, not the governors, who most discouraged freedom of the press. Publishers were often forced to apologize for any negative comments about the assembly members, and colonial newspapers would demand freedom of the press as the central piece while still surrendering it to the discourse. I want to give an example of John Peter Zenger. John Peter Zenger ran a newspaper called the New York Weekly Journal, and in 1733, he printed a criticism of the governor, New York Governor William Cosby, and accused him of corruption. Zenger was then accused of seditious libel, sedition being like a plot to overthrow the government and libel being like lies about it. And so he was charged with this because he had accused the governor of being corrupt. He never denied printing the material, so that Zenger was guilty was never actually in question. But Zenger's attorney takes an interesting approach. John Peter Zenger's attorney said, yes, this article appeared in our newspaper, but he challenged the prosecution to prove them false. He says, they accuse the governor of being corrupt. He's corrupt. Show that he's not corrupt, and then it will be libel. But if it's not a lie, then it's not libel. He claimed that it's not the cause. This trial is not the cause of just one poor printer, but it's the cause of liberty itself. And so he argued that the press has a liberty of both exposing and opposing tyrannical power by speaking and writing the truth. He basically says that truth is the defense against libel. And the jury pronounced him not guilty. Because of that, we see a shift in the way that the press is handled, at least in the colonies, that truth is always permitted. It also demonstrated that freedom of expression was becoming ingrained in the popular imagination. Roman numeral number 24. It's hard to put your finger exactly on what religion was like in the colonies, and it's not because it varies in different places, although it certainly does. That's usually our explanation of like why it's hard to talk about colonial government, or like colonial life, because it just changes based on that. But in religion, we find that it's hard to put your finger on it because religion in this era was a little bit of a squishy piece. We see the rise of a religious movement known as deism. Deism is a theological belief that God exists and has set up natural laws to govern the universe. And he did it at creation, that God made the moon and the stars and put them in their orbits to move independently. And so therefore God doesn't intervene in the world. He doesn't perform miracles because it would be outside of how a deist understands God's action. He also doesn't answer prayers because God has set the universe into motion and lets it spin. Deism was never a huge movement. Like a lot of people didn't actively believe in deism, but it was an influential belief system. For instance, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's theology would change over time. He's never really been a person you could pin down theologically. But I think most of his adult life would have been considered a deist. Thomas Jefferson, maybe the best example of American deism. Subpoint B. While educated Americans turned to deism, other colonists turned to a different movement known as pietism. Pietism came to America with German migrants in the 1720s, and pietism sparked a religious revival. Think of it as the word piety, right? Or to be pious. Pietism emphasized pious behavior, but also religious emotion and striving for a mythical union of God. It was a louder but also more personal take on religion than what was otherwise common in the colonies. In Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, the Dutch minister Theodor Jacob Frelinghuysen, he preached these sermons that were rousing, emotional sermons that fired up otherwise kind of stoic German settlers. In New England, an American-born pietist movement itself developed there. In 1730, the strict Calvinist and New England minister Jonathan Edwards, he restored Christian zeal to Congregationalist churches. Jonathan Edwards becomes the loudest voice of New England pietism. It's he that writes the sinners in the hands of the angry God. It's a rousing sermon that honestly is pretty convicting, even today. Subpoint C. In 1739, a compelling minister named George Whitefield took a page out of John Wesley's book. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, but had a compelling preaching style, and George Whitefield began to adopt that style into his own. And he transformed local revivals into a movement known as the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening led, at least initially by Whitefield, these tens of thousands of people gathered to go make a religious movement, to preach to tens of thousands at once. It made him a celebrity, and printers published his travel accounts and his conversion narratives and just the sermons themselves. The Great Awakening, it was a series of local events. It's not a nationwide movement, like as we think of it as like a holistic nationwide movement. They're local events that happen all over the country. And they were united by a commitment to a more emotional understanding of Christianity and a more personal understanding of Christianity than offered by the existing churches and religious movement. They had these flamboyant preachers, Jonathan Edwards, and it stressed this need for divine grace. The Great Awakening enlarged the boundaries of religious liberty, as essentially two groups began competing for the religious vision. You have the old lights, or the traditionalists, of kind of like the classic colonial church model, but also the new lights, these new revivalists trying to bring a new life and energy into Christianity, and both sides defended their worship rights as the traditional understanding of how the church operates, and then the new, more charismatic understanding of how the church operates. By the way, this is still kind of a glimpse into Christianity as both sides continue to argue over how the church operates and how the Holy Spirit's active in the world. Hundreds felt this new light of God's grace, and they were eager to go spread George Whitefield's religious message throughout their communities, though. And the new lights, they went beyond even just, like traditional Christian subjects. They criticized colonial taxes and maybe even surprisingly established churches themselves. They weren't enemies of Christianity, but they certainly didn't want to reinforce the old traditional model. The Great Awakening, it inspired criticism of a lot of aspects of colonial society. A few preachers explicitly condemned even slavery. Especially in the Chesapeake area, slaves would follow their model and were converting to Christianity. In Roman numeral number 25, let's talk about the imperial rivalries that were dominating the Atlantic world. And we'll focus on Spanish North America, which we haven't seriously considered in a few episodes. Spanish North America was a huge territory on paper. It covered a tremendous amount of land, but those land was sparsely populated with a few small urban clusters and otherwise a disconnected land. So like Spanish North America, it was big on paper, but not really big in control or in settlement. And despite establishing religious missions and presidios, the Spanish population in Spain's North American empire remained relatively sparse. A few cities became important, but they were pretty few and far between. Spain had ordered the colonization of California in response to a perceived Russian threat. Why is it always the Russians? And here I want to introduce Junipero Serra, who founded the first mission in what's now San Diego in 1769. Junipero Serra is the Apostle of California, and he was canonized by Pope Francis in 2015. St. Junipero is the namesake of the Sierra Foundation, who supports the formation of men and women to the religious life. But Junipero Serra has come under fire in recent years. Most of his criticism is not actually about Junipero himself, but instead really levied at what he represented, the idea of Europeans in the West and Christianity in Native America. Serra himself was a capable administrator. He was kind of a bureaucrat who organized Spanish settlements and Indian missions in California. He was a constant defender of Indian rights against Spanish brutality and brought innumerable people to Christ. But I think today when when you hear like Junipero Serra is the bad guy, I think it's really the symbol of evangelization that people don't like anymore, not Serra himself. He's a mid-level bureaucrat who spoke up for rights. California was a religious frontier, but still typical Spanish labor conditions brought a heavy death toll to the natives. And even though they're bringing Christianity, it's kind of that typical Spanish model that also brings a lot of oppression and death along the way. Subpoint B, let's focus on the French Empire. France was really Britain's great rival in Europe and North America. Kind of the old model of the rivalry with the Spanish that had died down, and England turned back to its favorite rival of France. And though the French colonial model in North America was very different than it was for British America, French models, they basically built up fur trade networks rather than agricultural exports. So France expanded its empire, but again with a smaller population, because it's not about large-scale farming, it's about land for hunting and trapping. The French also used North America as a place of cruel exile for criminals and for outcasts. So the French are using their territory just differently than the Spanish and the British are. In subpoint C, I want to tell one of the great subplots that will lay the ground for the American Revolution, and it's known as the French and Indian War. You'll also hear it called the 7 Years' War. Those terms are interchangeable, and we'll use both of them in this class. In the first half of the 18th century, wars against Spain and France set the stage for England to become the dominant power of Europe. The 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, began in 1754 as England tried to dislodge the French from western Pennsylvania. By 1756, fighting had spread to Europe, and it had pit France and Spain and Austria against Britain and Prussia. The British were losing until 1757, when William Pitt was named as Secretary of State. Pitt was an expansionist, and his efforts went to go cripple France by attacking its colonies. The war turned with the fall of Quebec as the heart of the American Empire, as basically like the war between the two sides became a war in the colonies. And with that victory in the French and Indian War, the British ousted the French traders from India. They seized the French territory in West Africa, as well as the Sugar Islands in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and they won Cuba and the Philippines from Spain. And the French and Indian War basically ends with the British whooping the French and taking Spanish possessions as well. In 1763, they settle it with the Treaty of Paris. There are so many treaties that have been settled in Paris. This one's the one in 1763 that ended the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And it granted British sovereignty over half of the continent of North America. French territory ended up getting so reduced to just a handful of islands in the West Indies and 2 islands near Newfoundland. All the sides in the 7 Years' War were under financial stress as a result of the war. Colonists came out of the war, though, with a heightened sense of collective identity, that they, British America, had fought against the tyrannies of France and of Spain and had emerged thinking themselves as Englishmen and victors of the fight. And that strengthened their collective identity and strengthened their pride as members of the British Empire. Subpoint D, our discussion of colonial rivalries isn't just between the imperial powers of Europe, it also carries over to the imperial powers of Native America. Because Britain's victory alarmed the Indians. They feared this influx of settlers, and many lost what seemed as like the balance of power between Spain and France and Great Britain that ended up guarding Indian autonomy. That balance of power has been disrupted, and in 1763, the Indians of the Midwest launched a revolt against British rule. The Ottawa chief Pontiac led a group of loosely confederated tribes in a major uprising against the British, known as Pontiac's Rebellion. The rebellion was waged against the British colonists after they had expanded their military presence in the Great Lakes area after the 7 Years' War. And by 1766, Pontiac and the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs negotiated an end to the war because the Native Alliance was weakening and breaking up. Ultimately, the Indians accepted British leadership, but in return for British establishing the 1763 Proclamation Line. The Proclamation Line barred any British American settlers from going west of the Appalachian Mountains, basically setting the Appalachian Mountains as the division between British America and Indian America. The British hoped to neutralize the conflict between the white settlers and the Native Americans, but they ended up provoking the wrath of the colonists. Settlers and land speculators, they hoped to take advantage of the French, but they were stopped at that proclamation line as people like hoping to swoop into what was French land. No, they were blocked at the proclamation line. The proclamation line of 1763 is often cited as one of the great grievances of the American Revolutionary War, that Americans just wanted to go west and go take that land that was needed in so short supply. The natives were unable to kick the British out of the Great Lakes region, but still the uprising demonstrated the viability of pan-tribal cooperation. The tribes could band together to go resist the European-American colonialism and against the Euro-American idea of territorial expansion. That also contributed to the deterioration of relations between Great Britain and its North American colonies, because even though they come out of the 7 Years' War thinking themselves as like proud to be British, the Proclamation Line reminds them that they're just provincial backwaters. Subpoint E, we're going to close this unit on the question of the Paxton Boys. The war deepened the hostility of western Pennsylvanian farmers towards Indians, and it also witnessed numerous assaults on Indian communities. In Paxton, Pennsylvania, a group of Scots-Irish frontiersmen became known as the Paxton Boys, and they formed this vigilante group to retaliate against natives in the aftermath of the Pontiac Rebellion. They destroyed the Indian village of Conestoga. They killed 6 natives and another 14 in Lancaster. The Paxton Boys accused the colony of treating Indians too leniently, and they petitioned the legislature to remove all of Indians from Pennsylvania altogether. Then they marched on Philadelphia in 1764 to go attack Indians, the Moravian Indians, near that city. The governor caved and capitulated to the Paxton Boys. They ordered Pennsylvania Indians altogether to be expelled out of it. It's amazing that Pennsylvania, at one time one of the best colonies for relations with Indians, ends up kicking Native Americans out altogether in response to the course of history that came. The Quakers of Pennsylvania, they're pacifists. They look at all this and say, are you kidding, all this violence? They resigned in protest and walked out of the assembly. No other colony in America had a smaller Indian population or a bigger determination of settlers to go eliminate all who remained. This story of rights and restrictions and demands for liberty and feeling like the liberty is squashed behind it, this is the story of early America. I can't wait to tell you more. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.